time. Okay, and there's still a few folks trying to join, but I see folks trickling in. We can start answering some of these the questions here. In general, I want to talk specifically about 9 and where we're at with it and where we're going with it. So you guys know mostly Pierre and I are working on the bulk of this right now. I'm doing a lot of the Python side work, refactoring things to be message-based and everything in the database and so on. And Pierre's working on the front end, the web front end, which is going to be an Angular JS app, and is talking to the back end over AJAX calls. So it's live updating and not a lot of page reloads. One question I wanted to address from Rail is about the master-slave logging protocol and whether that's going to be more async. Can you talk about what you mean by that?
Yeah, so for example, right now, if you lose your connection between the master and slave, it's just you lose your job.
Right. So that's an important problem that affects a lot of folks.
Yeah.
But it's actually a separate project from 9. So there was a Google Summer of Code project this summer, to work on that, called the New Slave Protocol. And that got partway through implementing compatibility for a new protocol called AMP, which is different from Perspective Broker, the remote procedure call that we use. That didn't get finished, and it's still in progress. But once that's in place, we should have much more capacity to build protocols that are resilient to things like connection failures, host reboots, stuff like that. So that's not necessarily going to be an 090, but certainly that's a parallel project, and we can ship it in 089 if we want to, before 9 is out, or if it's not done when 9 is out, then we'll ship it when it's done. So from the folks who are here, I think most of you know this stuff, but there's been a lot of questions throughout the 9 period, so I wanted to address these two that have come up several times. One of them is about compatibility with 9. So 090 is intended to be compatible, an upgrade from 089. You should be able to use roughly the same configuration files, roughly the same custom steps, custom schedulers, and so on, and should be able to slot right in. The thing that we're not implementing right now, not planning on implementing right now, is build history. So all that data that you've got in pickles for builds that have already occurred, we're not planning on importing that into the database. There's nothing actually preventing that. It's just a matter of saving a little bit of work so that we can get this shipped in time. So if that's important to someone who has the time to implement it, then there's certainly room to implement that. In terms of system compatibility, though, with all the talk about using message queuing and Rabbit backend and bigger databases and things like that, we've had a few folks worried that suddenly BuildBot has gone from pip installing BuildBot and running it to installing an entire replicated MySQL environment and a redundant RabbitMQ environment and a whole lot of infrastructure to set up BuildBot. And that's not the case. Like we do with databases right now, you'll be able to run BuildBot with a single node internal message queuing implementation that's just in pure Python. So it's only when you start to distribute multiple hosts that you need to start using some of these more sophisticated backends. And you already need MySQL in 088, but you'll also need a message queuing backend in 09. In terms of Python compatibility, same versions of Python are supported, and in terms of Twisted compatibility, roughly the same versions of Twisted are supported. There aren't a lot of new Python requirements either. So the requirements don't change a whole lot, and upgrades should be relatively easy. There is one trick to the upgrades, though, which is that a lot of custom steps use very synchronous calls to get logs and analyze logs. and they do so in a pretty inefficient way. It's very common in a shell step to run the shell command, and then in create summary, download the entire text of the log file from that shell command and do some regexps on it or something like that. And that's inefficient because you're loading potentially a lot of data into memory in one large string, when really log files are generally easily handled line by line. And it also is tricky in the new data API because you have to go to the database for that data. So it's an asynchronous call, whereas in 088 that's a synchronous call. You get that data immediately. So we're defining what's called new style steps, and those don't use this get log method. They don't use get text and read lines on logs. They use log observers to look at logs line by line as they come in, and they use asynchronous data API calls if they need to go back and look at what's in the logs. So that change is going to require some work to rewrite steps. That work actually isn't so bad, and because we have to rewrite all the steps in BuildBot itself, I've gotten pretty good at it and can write down how to do that. We're also going to implement support for new style steps in 08. So when we release the next version of 08, you can start rewriting your steps to be this new style already. So then when you upgrade to 09, the steps just work. So that's the compatibility story there. And that's a bit of a work in progress. I know what new steps look like, but I haven't implemented entirely both the support for old steps in 9 and the support for new steps in 8. I left part of that out. 090 at least will mostly support old style steps through some really ugly hacks. So you should be able to upgrade to 09. Most of your steps will still work. There may be some bugs, and if there are bugs, then upgrade that step to a new style step. But we're putting in a lot of compatibility hacks to try and make sure that transition is as easy as possible. And finally, it seems like everyone asks this when they first find out about the project: when will 09 be released? It's looking better now that we're getting some progress on it. Pierre's been a great help in helping me find the way through to get things implemented efficiently and not get stuck and spin my wheels. But the more people working on it, the faster it's going to get done. It's been 2 years since we made this initial project branch, and at the rate we're going, it's probably another 9 months to a year. But certainly could go faster than that with more people and more time. And hey, if I lose my job, it'll be faster. All right. If there aren't other general questions or things in the QA there, I did have a few more specific things I wanted to address. But before we do that, we should probably look at I should probably point out that there is a demo of what the front end looks like right now at 9.buildbot.org. I'm sorry, 9.buildbot.net. If you log into that site, you can see what the rough layout looks like here, and if you force a build on that, you can actually watch the build progress. You can see the individual steps go green. You can even watch the log files as they're produced there. And there's some hacks to work around stuff that's not finished in that. It's certainly not a working BuildBot instance right now, but you can see what this is going to look like and kind of get a visual feel for it. I would hope Pierre can't manage to join from his network, unfortunately, so I can't get him to do a demo of this, but that would be pretty ideal if we could manage it. Maybe in the next Hangout. There's a few other technical things I'd like to get into, but I actually need to talk to some of the folks implementing them. If anyone else has other questions, though, and would like to speak up. Oh, Pierre, you are in here. I see. Do you want to try and do a demo there? Pierre can't talk, but we can see him. we'll see if we can fix that up later. Um, and I think everyone else is muted, but Pierre, you're not muted right now. So in terms of getting started, I know, Xavier, you're looking at getting started and working on BuildBot 9, which would be wonderful. There is a README in the branch in GitHub, a readme.md, and I just refactored that about a week ago so that it has a nice list of tasks for people to get started on. Some of those are pretty small tasks and can get you started with looking at how the data API works or looking at the web front end or something like that. Some of them are more involved and are things that are based on good question. They're based on how we can on stuff that we've thought about and tried to figure out and sort of have vague ideas of how we're going to implement it. But the first few of them are things like adding an extra field to changes, for example, or changing the way that links are handled in the JSON results or something like that. So those are good ways to sort of dive into the code and have a task in mind, come up with a pull request that will be pretty useful without spending a whole lot of time on it. And then once you kind of work up through those, some of the more complicated stuff will seem less daunting at that point. And I would love to have more people hacking on this, not only because more work will make faster progress, but because there's a lot of things in here that have really just come out of my mind and Pierre's mind, which may not make sense to other people. We may be missing something pretty significant here. So certainly more eyes looking on this will make shallower bugs too, and that's a good thing. Just looking through the list here of relatively easy things. Another example is that right now log chunks are stored in plain text on the database, and they're stored in the chunks that they come in. So as the shell command produces a couple lines of logs, to get those displayed in the web UI, we have to insert those few lines into the database. And that means that we may have a lot of very small chunks of 1 line or 2 lines in the database. But once a step is finished, we can go back over those logs and combine those into larger chunks of 100 lines or up to 64K, whatever fits in the database. That will make faster fetches from the database, and it will also mean less overhead for the database storage. So right now that's not implemented. But we would like to implement that. That's a good question. We would like to implement that before we release. It's certainly not a requirement, but it will make things more efficient. And Pierre just mentioned in the IRC channel timestamping those chunks. That's a really good idea. It's something we hadn't thought of before. I hadn't thought of before. But it can be nice to know at what time a particular log line was produced. Right now we have no tracking of that information. So that'd be really interesting to implement. Probably not on the critical course for 090. There's certainly room to add that where we would add a different log type that has timestamp lines and then interpret that correctly in the web front end to be able to display those timestamps. So the step work I'm working on right now is we're getting almost to the point where we can remove the status objects, the step status and the build status, the build request status, and the build set status, and all of those status classes that are currently ending up in pickles. Once those are removed, we pretty much we'll have a working build bot that writes to databases, sends messages, and so on. But it's still going to lack a lot of features that people need. So, for example, build request merging we're changing the way we do that, and that's not implemented yet. The status plugins, as Fears mentioned here, the mail status, the IRC status, those need to be refactored to use the data API. But the data API is sort of built for them. So the IRC status is basically going to take messages on in the message queuing system, translate them into strings, and send them to IRC. It should actually be simpler in the new implementation than it was in the old implementation. And there's certainly a good deal of work left to do on the web front end as well. We need some work to build backends for messaging. Right now, the only backend that exists is the in-memory single process backend. But I'm actually, for other reasons, playing with Kombu right now, which is a front end to AMQP. And it's fairly straightforward. It would be fairly straightforward to build an AMQP interface using either that or TXAMQP or any of a number of libraries that are out there that can interface with AMQP servers. AMQP is the protocol that RabbitMQ and other servers speak. And picking up a task in the README. So for the moment, we've been sort of doing this by mentioning in email or IRC that we're working on things. But a very firm way to sort of reserve a task in the README is just to submit a pull request to put your name on it. So if you're looking through the README, you see one of them is assigned to users for changes is assigned to Sam Kleinman. And I just added that when I was refactoring it. But certainly, if you're going to work on something, you can mention it in IRC or email, and I can write your name in here. Or if you want to make a pull request to just add your name to one of these, then we'll know that you're working on it. And that gives us a nice date stamp. We can look back at the change and see, oh, I added this person's name 6 months ago and I haven't heard from them. Maybe I should go check up on them. Pierre's got lots of good things to bring up. So one of the tricky bits with the web front end running potentially on a different machine than the masters is on a different machine than the builds, is that we want to be able to communicate control functions from the web UI back to the machines running the builds. So, for example, if you fill out a form for a force scheduler, you need to be able to send that information for the force to the master that's going to do the build. It's possible to configure the masters running the web status to have read-only access to the database. So we can't just do an insert of a build request into the database there. We need to be able to communicate back to the scheduler that's running on a different machine. We will be using AMQP. Well, we will be using the messaging system for that. So we'll define some specific messages and message formats that can get sent from the web front end to the force scheduler, and the force scheduler will treat that as a kind of RPC to say, okay, this is the requested force build, and then it goes and makes all of the objects in the build bot database, the build set and the build request, and so on, to get that build started. So it's a form of RPC over the message queuing system. I think we should probably invent the format for that. Should probably be purpose-specific JSON objects, and we should have a different routing topic for them in the message queuing system that doesn't look like an update to an object, but is specifically labeled as a control message. I don't think we need to have those be bidirectional, so it's not quite RPC. That's not true. We do need to have parameters validated by the backend scheduler. So these communications do need to be bidirectional. But I think we can accomplish that with purpose-built JSON things instead of using some sort of pre-built RPC library. So we'll need an ACK to know that the build has scheduled, and probably to give the build set ID that was scheduled. And we'll need to know, these parameters were incorrect, or these are the available branches that you can display in your form for the force scheduler. Yeah, and we need to do that's sort of a typical RPC over MQ generally involves setting up a specific queue or topic for a reply. So you send a message to a generic endpoint that says, please perform this operation, and in that message you include the topic that you were listening on for a response, and that could be based on some sort of unique ID. So response.unique ID, and then you'll listen for messages with that topic, and those are the response. I think that's probably the best way to implement that. JSON RPC is really more of an HTTP design protocol. I'm not sure it'd be appropriate over MQ. And we can use UUIDs for that as long as they're based on some unique